Hello everyone, if you're watching this video, you're probably aware that Darrington Press and the crew of Critical Role recently released an open beta for their Daggerheart gaming system. And I'm an engineer, I like games, I like rules, I like math, and I started to take a look at the system. And as I was watching some of the initial videos, they said, hey, help us break the game. You ask me to break a game, I'm in. Now I will say that this video is going to be a whole lot of math. I plan to do some character builds and post them up on YouTube for people to consider for playing. And if I'm going to build a level 1 character, then I need to know how the game works, where we're going, where we're going to end up at level 10, how to build the whole character in order to build the right things at level 1. So before we can even do that, I have to hack the math of the game, the statistics, find out what's going on, determine if there's broken mechanics in the game that we can take advantage of. And obviously the goal is to generate feedback for the community and ultimately for the game designers themselves going out of the beta and into the production gaming system. Want to be able to fine-tune and fill any holes. So I'm going to shortcut the whole rules part. If you want to know how to play Daggerheart, there's videos out there. The Critical Role team did a good job of explaining a lot of stuff, how to build a character. Look up their videos and go take a look. There's resources on the internet. There's the Daggerheart homepage. And then there's the Nexus where you can go to the Daggerheart version and create characters. There's already a tool for that. So again, shortcut all that stuff. If you want to go look it up, those content creators deserve that view from you. For my point of view, I'm going to tear apart the math, go through a bunch of statistics, and I'm telling you right now, if you're not into that kind of thing, this video is probably going to be pretty boring for you. But I do need to know what makes it tick and how to build characters all the way up. If this bores you, just look at my character builds. This is meant to set a baseline for myself, and of course for anybody who's interested in that kind of thing to figure out the basis of how I'm building these characters. It's something you can watch. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the mathematical significance of leveling, the mechanics of the skills and combat roles. We're going to talk about bonuses, things like that. We're going to look at the hope and fear mechanics. We're going to look at the attrition in the game that comes through stress, armor, tanking, and whether or not dying is a real thing. We're going to go through some battle math and compare how player characters and the GM interact. And then we're going to try to make a summary for character building to sort of establish a baseline for how I would build characters and establish a baseline for players and GMs that, maybe give some context for starting a game if you're going to play test it. So as characters level up to 10, the skills are limited to tiers of progression. So each tier has a set of 3. So if you start at level 1 and you consider that as your baseline level, then each tier from there is 3 levels within one set of upgrades. So levels 2, 3, and 4 pull from the same list of upgrades that you can select. 5, 6, and 7, and then 8, 9, and 10. It limits your stat progression and caps the stats with a relatively low range. At level 1, you can have a +2 on your main stat to start out. And by the time you get to level 10, it'll only get to +5 as a main stat. So not a wide range of ability scores. And there's reasons to do that in a rules light game. We'll talk about that later. Each level gets you 2 points of progress within the tier. So for each tier, you get a total of 6 selections. So you can't have everything. Level to 1 to 10 in Daggerheart, looking at the rules in the system, it should feel similar to levels 1 to 10 in D&D. I think each level is going to be more clear, let's say, leveling up. But the levels 2, 5, and 8 and level 10 are going to be jumps in power. The 2, 5, and 8 because you get to a new tier, and level 10 because the level 10 powers in general are pretty powerful in the game. The higher skills read sometimes like they're incredibly strong, but if you look at they take 3 hope, 5 hope, sometimes multiple stress points, anywhere from 3 to 7 stress if you really want to make the spell worth it. So those resources, even though some of them written on cards look really powerful, in actual gameplay you'll get them about once a day or you'll have to take a bunch of short rests just to recharge enough stress to use that power again, for example. So I think some of these higher powers, there's going to be a marked difference between powers that are passive that you just get all the time and those that you actually have to power up with resources that are going to be competing for all of the other things that you could use those resources for. So I think a level 10 character in Daggerheart is probably going to feel in some ways stronger than a D&D character at level 10, and in some ways the progress is going to feel pretty flat by the time you get to level 10. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the end. The rolling system, it's a 2d12 system for the players. It's a d20 for the DM in combat. Characters using a 2d12 to resolve tests. The results can be anywhere from 2 to 24, and this is a statistical bell curve distribution, peaking at 13. We'll take a look at that in a second. So it's relatively simple to calculate character abilities and your reliability in generating success. The DM does use a d20 on rolls against the characters, and this gives the Dungeon Master a higher degree of variability, so the players pretty reliably get successes, and the DM might get massive swings and successes and failures in a row, like we experience in Dungeons & Dragons, and maybe that makes for a better story. So if we take a look at the statistical bell curve here, if you have a baseline versus a check that's a 13 difficulty class, 13 is the average roll for 2d12, and that gives you a 54% chance of succeeding on that roll. If you just add a +2 to your stat, that number jumps all the way up to plus 68.7, and you will get a +2 based on your main trait. So if your main trait is +2, you get that +2, and you're already looking at a 2/3 chance of success. If you add another +1 beyond that and you get to a +3, it's another 6%. And if you look at it as adding another 6% on a 68, it may not seem that impressive, but if you look at your chances to fail, you realize that 6% increase reduces your chance of failure by 20%. So every +1 that you can get that's outside of this curve is going to make a huge difference in the game once you get past that baseline of +2. So giving a +1 to any relevant stat is always going to be the highest priority. Skills that allow boosted rolls or advantage are good when you already have a high probability. But the way statistics work, you have to be careful adding a bunch of bonuses to something that you already have a low probability on. So let's say you have a difficulty check of 18 and you have a skill with no pluses. If you can't find a way to add a bunch of pluses to that, you've already got a low probability roll. Adding advantage to that does give you chances to succeed, but if your hope resource is limited and the help action is not something that you can just constantly do, then you're better off boosting rolls where you already have a good probability of success. There are ways in the game to manipulate the dice, but in general, there's skills that trigger rerolls that are going to be very powerful, just let you re-roll the dice entirely. But the bonuses, again, it lends itself very well to success, and even at baseline, you got a 2/3 chance of success, and we go from there. It's fairly highly reliable. So in Daggerheart, the first thing to note, players should feel success in a lot of circumstances, unless the GM presents them with circumstances that have really high difficulty ratings. It should be possible. The other problem is that with the stats being so flat, let's say you're trying to pick a lock and there's a character in your party with +2 finesse and they fail. A character with +0 finesse still has better than a 50% chance of succeeding if it's a baseline roll. So it could lead to the possibility that every single character in the party can legitimately try almost every roll in the game, with your best character only having maybe 1 or 2 more points to add to a certain roll than any other character. So I think that it's going to be a little harder to define roles, and maybe they want it that way so that any character can play any role. I don't know, but it does mean that, for lore, anybody might know any given relevant fact, for example. Let's talk about the hope and fear mechanic. When you roll these 2d12s, one of them represents a hope die, one of them represents a fear die. Whichever number is higher gives you that mechanic. So if you roll hope higher, you gain a hope for your character to use later. If you roll fear, you give fear to the game master to use against you. So hope fuels powerful skills for the player characters, and fear is at the GM's discretion. There's some guidance on how to use it, but there wasn't very strong guidance, and we'll talk about that more later. If you roll the same number, it's a critical success. You succeed at what you're doing. You get a hope. You clear a stress. Obviously, rolling the same number on both dice is the best thing. It's like a crit hit in Dungeons & Dragons. Players, don't be afraid of using fear, and don't hoard hope. So when you look at the skills and abilities, there might be this tendency to sit on your hope and wait to use it later. But, if somebody's opening a lock and you've got 2 or 3 hope, just spend it, give them advantage, help them out, make the rolls better. Building up, you only have a bank of 5 hope, so building up way past 5 hope, you just lose it. So use it. Use it while you got it. I would consider that 3 is a full hope bank if you've got more than 3 hope. If you get your 4th hope, find something to spend it on. And don't be afraid of fear. The GM should be providing consequences for fear, but that should be part of the storytelling. It should be part of the game. And if you're a GM and you let the fear build up, that's not a good thing either. And just remember, if you're using hope on a skill, let's say you go into combat and there's something that you could use hope to power a skill, there's a 50-50 chance that the hope die is going to come out higher. Actually, it's better than a 50% chance because equal numbers do give you a critical success where you get hope anyway. So you've got a good chance of getting the hope back even if you spend it. So again, don't let yourself cap out at 5 hope. The conclusion that I have from all of this, if we look at character building, right from level 1, you need to think about ways for your character to spend hope, and you need to think about ways for your character to use the stress mechanic to power some powerful, some good things in the game for your character, right? You should have what I will call a hope sink, and you should have a stress sink. There's a team up that you can do once per long rest for 3 hope. It's a lot of hope, but it's some interesting mechanics. And if you really need to succeed at something and you can't afford to fail, then team up is the way to go. Blow through a bunch of help, make sure the roll gets made in the right way. And you can always help your allies for 1 hope to generate advantage. That's an extra D6 on the roll. Averages 3 to 4 additional points. And as we talked about, the additional bonus is a big deal. If you've already got a 68% chance of succeeding, rolling another D6 puts your statistics up in the 90%. So that it's not a guaranteed success, but makes it increasingly unlikely that you'll fail. I did look at the idea of hope loading, talked through this with a couple other experienced players, and the party could theoretically just take a whole bunch of nonsense actions. Or actions that might make sense. I'm a ranger. I'm going to track something. Roll the dice. Generate fear. Give that to the DM. Don't care. I'll track again. I'll track again. I'll track again. And you make 27 rolling tracks to make sure that tracking rolls to make sure that you get your hope ball built up to 5, and everybody in the party gets their hope maxed out. So when you go into combat, everybody's got 5 hope, and that sounds good. The DM caps at 10 fear, and you'll overfill the DM. On hope, or on fear, I mean. But if you take a look at the mechanics of this, the DM really needs to be using the fear, if not as soon as they get it, then almost as soon as they get it. And it does give advice on how to use fear to, create some attrition or, tell a story. So basically, if the party goes too crazy, and again, this doesn't mean you can't make out of combat rolls. It just means if the party's trying to create a whole bunch of nonsense rolls just to load up their hope, then the GM has to respond with consequences. If he doesn't, this game is going to be so easy. It's going to be low stakes and easy. If a GM ever gets fear past 5 or 6, you really got to use it. Let's say a ranger is tracking and has success with fear, and there's 4 of fear in the pool already. Man, you got to spend that fear. Maybe it's a trap that gets sprung and the ranger avoids it, but it takes a stress, the marks on armor. Some kind of small attrition where it doesn't feel like the GM is out to get the party, but where it's clear that even when you succeed with fear, there's going to be these minor consequences that are going to add up to attrition over time and make the game dangerous or meaningful. I think hope loading's not a good idea. Now, again, it's up to the GM to manage it, and if your GM doesn't manage it and you want to do that as a player, then you can, but I recommend against it. It could end up with this. I've heard feedback already from players who have tried it and play tested it, and they said, we ended the game and all the players had a bunch of hope and all the GM had a bunch of fear in the bank. And my thought is, why? With the game set up the way it is, why the heck would you have fear, right? Let's say we had a bunch of fear built up and combat starts, and maybe there's only 3 creatures that you have in the combat as the GM. Everybody's all loaded up on hope and you have 8 fear. Just trade in a couple fear, turn them into action tokens, trade in a couple more fear, add another monster to the combat. Make it dangerous. Give all your monsters actions, use that fear. Fear converts to action tokens at a 2-to-1 rate, so every fear gives you 2 actions. So you shouldn't run out of monsters, you shouldn't run out of fear, you shouldn't run out of tokens. Just the GM has to understand how that works and manage it. And that's going to be the difference between combat being super easy, or let's say you go into combat against 4 bears and the GM just trades in fear and adds 2 more bears. It's a completely different combat now. It's going to be much more difficult, and the GM will constantly be able to use all their tokens, and they won't end up in the situation where you've got a bunch of tokens and only 1 monster. I believe in the playtest, there was a point where the environment took an action or several actions. Matt Mercer was just making stuff up as he went along, and there were vines restraining the characters and things like that. So there's always a way to use these action tokens and fear to tell a story, but there's not much guidance that tells you here's things that we consider acceptable. So a new GM might struggle to figure out what's acceptable and what's not. If you have too much fear and only 1 action token, you can convert that fear to action tokens. I heard feedback from a group that said, we entered the game and players had stacks of hope and the GM had stacks of fear. Again, I don't know. That can only happen if players aren't using their hope. Because again, you can always use hope to either team up or help your party members, so why not use it to help? I would say in that case, there just wasn't enough attrition in the game, and for one-shots, that's going to be difficult. If you just put together a group for 1 try at this playtest, it's going to be easy, and we'll get to that in a second as well. All right, so in general, we have to avoid a hope loading situation where the players feel like they're trying to win. This game, just like Dungeons & Dragons, it's not hard to win the game if you want to, right? You can use the rules, abuse the rules, surprise your GM with all kinds of crazy stuff. That can always happen, but if you're trying to win, this game is really tailored around more of telling the story and creating things as you go along and using the dice rolls to tell a story rather than winning and losing. So if we get into this mode of trying to win the game, then the GM has to fight with the players, and it could easily feel like the GM is trying to make them lose, and we don't want that either. I think the balance there for a new GM, again, and this is just trying to sort out the statistics and the math of the game, a new GM is just going to have to figure out ways to create problems for the party, create attrition, stress, armor, hit points, and challenge the party without, taking it over the top and just seeming like you're constantly trying to kill them. Specifically, the resource of stress, it's used to fuel skills. Take a stress to do something. You can also take a stress if you get hit for damage that's below your minor threshold. You'll take a stress instead of a hit point. And that makes hit points and stress kind of on the same scale, where hit points are, what keeps you alive, and then stress is what comes on top of that to to manage before you start taking real damage, so to speak. So it's going to be a trade-off between stress and hit points. And the problem is that I think people are always going to look at that and say, well, I don't want to use up my last stress because if I get hit in combat, I want to be able to take that stress. My advice is stress is a resource to power your powerful abilities. Unless you are specifically building like a guardian tank or something like that, use your stress. Use it up. If you take a hit point of damage later, you'll have to manage that in combat. And don't be afraid to use your hit points, right? You're not dead until the last one is gone. And in this game, it's pretty hard to sneak up on somebody and one-shot them. So with that being the case, use the stress, right? In D&D, stress is kind of the idea of stress to me feels like the idea of front-loading skills. So in regular D&D 5e, when you first enter combat, there's 4 monsters. The party needs to focus damage and kill one of those monsters. Every one of the 4 is going to get their turn. They're all going to do something. And as soon as you can take one of them off the board, that's one less action for the enemies. And it's a thing that escalates very quickly in your favor once you remove 1 or 2 of those characters off the board. So abilities that have cooldowns or use a lot of resources, you just throw them in the first round of combat and do tons of damage, and just do just whatever burst damage you can do. It's really effective. In this game, it really depends on the number of monsters. If you try to look at the dynamics between the players and the GM, if there's 5 monsters, there's plenty of places for the GM to use their action tokens when they get a turn. So killing 1 monster quickly is not nearly as effective. On the other hand, if there's only 2 monsters, once you kill one of them, the GM statistically won't be able to use their resources in their round of combat. So I would say manage your stress, use it when it makes sense. If you want to burn it for a quick kill and that makes sense in your current situation, do so. If there's something attacking your wizard and you're afraid that the wizard's going to die, use your stress to manage that situation. Just don't be afraid to use it. It's there for a reason. The attrition in the game, overall, how do you end up dying, right? So this is a storytelling system in the combat. It's mathematically simple attrition. You take stress. When you take damage, you take hit points based on how much damage and comparing that to your thresholds. Again, I don't want to go through all the details of that. That's explained elsewhere. But the moral of the story is you decide when to use your armor to take less hit points of damage from a particular hit or convert that hit into stress. So you have this sort of sliding scale of take it, leave it, try to reduce it, use your armor resource. When your armor resource is used up, everybody will be looking for a rest. So if you walk into a combat with all of your resources, your armor slots are all unmarked, your stress is all unmarked, it can be a pretty tough combat and you're not going to have a problem with it. Attrition is only going to happen over the course of several combats, and if you have several combats within the same day, it will escalate the attrition. And once you start going into these combats with a couple of your armor slots already marked, a couple of your hit points already missing, it really changes the dynamics of the combat, and it's really going to make everything feel more dangerous. If you're a GM and you run this and you have 3 rests per day and you have 2 combats per day, the party should honestly not be in danger of dying. Ever. And for me, at least, that's not a fun game. I want to push the characters to the limit. I want to see them get down to their last few hit points. I want to see people make a death roll every 8th session. Not frequently, but I want that to be a possibility so that players don't forget that sometimes you got to make a death move, and sometimes, if nothing else, you got to remake a character. There are 3 different things that get affected simultaneously. Again, we're trying to pull apart the math and statistics, right? Armor, stress, and hit points. When you take a short rest, it doesn't work like D&D. You only get to do 2 things. You can repair your armor, 2 armor slots on a short rest. You can remove 1d4 stress. So if you have 5 stress, there's no guarantee you're going to get rid of more than 1. So a short rest, you could get 2 armor slots, remove 1 stress, and that's all you get. So over the course of the day, it will start to add up if there's attrition in combat. It does recommend only 3 rests per day, and then the next one needs to be a long rest. I think that feels fair, but again, if you're allowing a rest and then the party travels for a little bit and then they take a second rest with no combat in between, it's not going to feel dangerous. Again, we're going to be able to get back enough stress and reduce our repair our armor, all that stuff, and go back into the next combat again fully refreshed. So if you're only planning for a couple combats a day between long rests, then you really maybe cut that back from 3 short rests in a day to only 2. Or, don't let your players take a short rest. Let them know that the area that they're in is too dangerous for a short rest, something like that. So there's some things to think about. If you give them too many rests, it's not going to feel, again, this is just about balancing the GM's actions, the player's actions, and whether or not the game feels dangerous. If the game doesn't feel very dangerous for your player characters and it's something that they want, reduce the amount of rests or give them more combats in a day. We'll solve the problem pretty easily. Let's look at the stat of evasion, and then we'll look at the stat of armor. So combining the prior discussion, the GM's die is a D20. It's less predictable than 2D12. The evasion stat, once you get to a certain level, is really strong. Avoiding an attack altogether means that you're not going to use armor, you're not going to take hit points of damage, you're not going to take stress. The enemy simply misses. So on any miss, you're saving so much attrition that it's very valuable. Any character can have any armor at creation. So I think characters that generally have good evasion should really try to make the evasion their strongest stat. And again, you have to use light armor for that, and you have to give up a lot. But at the end of the day, if you get missed 50% of the time, then you don't need that much armor. And maybe you'll take more hit points of damage when you get hit, but you won't get hit as often. So statistically, evasion is a strong stat for characters that start with good evasion. If we look at armor, again, any character can have any armor at creation. So while we're looking at the light armor to take the +1 evasion for characters that already have it, we really want to look at characters with low threshold values for the heavier armors. So again, let's say you get hit for a severe hit with light armor on. If your light armor can take it off of severe, that's all you're looking for, to just cut it down by 1 hit point. If you look at characters with low thresholds, then like the wizard, for example, has a minor threshold of 2, and I think a severe threshold is 14, or something like that. You can get 13 armor starting out if you use plate mail and a tower shield. So basically, a severe hit on a wizard could be completely nullified all the way down to a stress with 1 use of armor. So heavy armors are going to be far more effective with characters that have a low threshold value, and characters that have high thresholds, or let's say thresholds that are in the middle somewhere, can make use of the medium armors very well. So like a sentinel, you're actually better off putting a breastplate or chainmail onto a sentinel. They already have high thresholds, so you can just cut it down by 1 threshold and save 1 hit point without giving up evasion, again, because evasion's a good stat. So what we're looking at then, characters with good evasion work their evasion. Characters with low thresholds buy the heaviest armor. Characters that are in the middle can pick whichever of the medium armors make the most sense for their character. The problem is when you wear heavy armor, you get in the range of auto hit. So for a wizard, for example, you do get that ability to knock damage down really far and take far less hit points. But in exchange for that, you end up with a evasion score of 4, which means that 85% of the time you're going to get hit in combat. It's not an auto hit, but it's pretty close. So it means that you have to use your armor all the time. And again, the attrition is going to be throughout the day. So when you're using heavy armor, the goal is use it on characters where you can cross 2 thresholds with 1 use of the armor. All right, so just for straight up tanking, If we look at characters and enemies, they can move a short distance as part of their turn. So they close in from close distance to melee distance and make an attack. Anything in close range becomes dangerous for characters that are weak or don't want to get hit. I don't see skills to stop that. There's not an attack of opportunity that I saw, or a penalty or punishment for characters leaving melee range. So if you approach a character and you mark it with your, I call it marking when you put your character next to an enemy. So you take a tank and you mark a character with it, that character, the enemy can just walk away from the tank and go bite the wizard. I don't see anything stopping it. It's good storytelling. There are ways for a tank to intervene. There's some skills that say if they attack somebody that's not you, you can take the damage for them, things like that. So there's some things to interfere, but generally the idea of having a specific tank does sort of not exist in this game. Again, there are some skills that force enemies to attack you, but if that's what you're doing on a turn, you're giving the GM a token, and with that token he's going to attack your character, and in the meantime you didn't do something else. So I don't see that these skills, at least from an initial read, have a good value in combat. But basically it's going to come down to this. If you build a tank and you give away all your evasion and you wade into one of these little group mobs of 3 or 4 skeletons and they all hit you for 3 damage, it's below your minor threshold. It's no problem. You don't even have to use your armor, but that's going to give you 3 stress. Each tiny bit of damage still results in stress. Once your stress fills up, you're taking hit points. So if you're a tank and you wade into a bunch of small combatants, you will fill up your stress and hit points very quickly, and they will overwhelm you and take you down, again, because it's almost auto hit. So evasion is better in that circumstance, or just avoiding the group monsters and letting mages and characters with area effect damage take down the groups of enemies. So that's something to think about when we're doing character building. And then boss monsters who have decent stats and heavy hits are controlled easily by evasion tanks. There are skills to boost evasion, and they're also controlled by armor tanks that have high thresholds. So even if you get hit at later levels, you get hit for 48 damage, your severe threshold is high, your major threshold is high, and your armor covers the gap in between. So a boss monster could hit you for a couple hit points at the most, or with an evasion tank, just don't get hit. So there's good ways to control boss monsters for either, but armor tanks are going to have to be very careful about rushing in against a lot of small enemies. If we look at the evasion stat, rogues start with 12, ranger and warrior have 10. Sorcerer, I think, for whatever reason, has 9. I don't know all the characters that well, but those are all good evasion scores. And on a D20 with a +0 to hit, if we can get our evasion to 13, which is possible for warriors and rangers quite easily, it means that 60% of the attacks will miss us. When we do get hit, we'll reduce armor by 1. So the big thing is, if you have a decent evasion, don't give it away. So characters with 10 or 12 evasion, if you take heavy armor and start giving away your evasion score, statistically it's very bad. In total, if I do the math, at the first 2 tiers, evasion tanks are quite effective. In the final tier, by the time you get to level 8, 9, and 10, you can add enough armor slots and enough good armor and get advanced armor and all that. And high thresholds for damage and big armor will surpass the evasion tanks eventually. The bone domain is very good, and there's some other stuff that helps with evasion. Again, sorcerers have a skill that allows them to add to their evasion. So the conclusion is, evasion fighters are good at avoiding hits, will shine in fights with a lot of small or medium enemies, and big boss monsters are easily controlled by armor tanks. Again, that's what the math says. I haven't played the game enough to know if that's the circumstance in all cases, but it certainly looks like that from reading the adversaries. Dying. Death is likely in Daggerheart if your GM is optimizing fear. So let's say, for example, that again, you start combat with a bunch of fear, and in that first time that the GM gets a turn, They add a couple monsters, make all the monsters take turn, use the fear, use the tokens, and put your party in a very dangerous situation. Death is it's a reality. A lot of monsters can hit early game characters for 2 hit points a shot. You start out with 6 hit points, you get hit 3 times, you use up 3 armor slots, maybe you've got 3 hit points by then, and if you get a critical hit, you get hit severely. I shouldn't say critical hit. If you get hit above your severe category, you can take 3 hit points in once, and that's you being dead. So if your GM is really challenging you, dying is a real thing in this game, and it can come up pretty fast. So once you get to 2 hit points or less, the game gets pretty scary. Once you do mark your last hit points, you get a chance on a death move, and there's 3 things you can do, if I remember correctly. One is that you go unconscious, you can be saved later. You'll live, but you lose 1 point of hope permanently. That's the safest route if you don't want your character to go away. You can die and go out in a blaze of glory. Let's say you're playing a character in a one-shot, you don't care, it doesn't matter. You can do blaze of glory and help win. Or if like you don't mind and you want to roll up another character anyway, whatever. You get a critical success in whatever you want to do and go out in a blaze of glory. You also have a chance roll, and you basically roll your 2d12s, and if hope is higher or you get a critical success, then you live. Now, there are ways in the game to change the hope roll. For example, there are certain abilities that allow you to replace your hope die with a d20. And I believe, I don't see anything in the game that contradicts it. I don't see anything in the death move that says you can't use other skills. Maybe I missed it. But it does look like you can modify that and use your d20. And if that's the case, you can take a death roll, replace your hope die with a d20, and statistically have 77% chance that you're going to come out of it alive. It's not a guarantee. 23% chance your character's dead and gone forever. But if you do get there, at least you'll have a gimmick to let you give it a try. Sorcerers have an ability that lets you change the dice. I can't remember if that says it has to be an attack roll. Maybe I'm misremembering, but if that skill applies to a death roll, then you simply roll, and if it's hope, you're great, and if it's not hope, you switch the dice, and you're fine. So there are some gimmicks, I think, to get around dying in the game, especially at later levels, but basically you don't want to get there. You don't want to be making death moves. I don't think there's a good character that's based around succeeding at death moves. So the conclusion is avoid attrition, pay attention to it, try to manage it, and prepare a gimmick if you think your character is going to be at high risk of dying. Character generation is easy. You'll have another character in 10 minutes if you die. So, but like D&D, we get attached to the character, to their story, and we don't really want them to die. And resurrection in this game is severely limited. You can take the resurrection spell, and then you get to use it like once ever. So I guess there's chances to use it more than once, but it permanently goes to your vault. So they, from all appearances, they really don't want you to bring back characters that die. I'm not sure why. I would rather have death be a realistic thing, and that way the GM isn't afraid to challenge players all the way down to death. Or maybe the fact that you can save your character and just burn a permanent hope slot is enough to say, well, if you do die, you don't. If you do have to make a death move, you don't have to die if you don't want to. I don't know. I like it in D&D that resurrection's a thing. I think the Critical Role folks have made resurrection like a huge storyline in the game when it happens, and it's fun, and it's a huge part of the story. Huge part of the story. When characters can't come back, it's also a huge part of the story. But I don't know. Something to be thought about. Going on to battle math. You take your turn. You add a token to the action tracker. When a character fails a roll or succeeds with fear, then it's the GM's turn. GM gets to use as many tokens as they want. They get to use as many fear as they want, but each of their enemy characters only gets to take 1 turn per GM action. You can't have 4 bears and 8 tokens and make all your bears act twice. They each get to go once. Then you got to turn it back over to the players and let them go. Fear can be used to power abilities that are written in the adversary cards. Some abilities use a fear, like there's some group abilities. Burn a fear, and then all these characters close in and do 3 damage each, something like that. There's boss characters that have 2 and 3 fear abilities that are very damaging or put really restrictive conditions on players. So there's lots of different ways that these tokens and fears can be used in combat. Again, the moral of the story is don't let fear build up. If you're a GM and you start a turn and you have 4 bears and you have 8 tokens and 8 fear, make that dangerous for the party. You know, add another bear. All 5 of them take actions. Use fear to power some of their abilities. You know, just blow through it, because when you're down to 1 bear, it doesn't do you any good to have 5 action tokens and 6 fear in the bank. At that point, you convert your tokens to fear and get ready for non-combat. Anyway, some thoughts. When we take this down, again, if we're going to do, the whole idea here is I'm sorting this out to do character building. So let's go through the actual math, how it works, right? You attack, you do 6 damage, you look at the enemy, it's past their minor threshold, so they're going to take 1 hit point of damage. In return, you've given an action token to the board. If you generated fear, it's the equivalent of 3 actions. Okay, you're going to generate fear statistically around half the time. So for every 2 hit points of damage that you do, you give 4 total actions to the game master. With those 4 actions, the likelihood is they're going to do more than 2 damage back to you. Again, you roll fear 50% of the time, so every other roll will generate fear statistically, more or less. Allowing for critical successes at something like 45% of the rolls generate fear. But anyway, so half the time you'll generate fear, you'll pass the turn over to the GM, he'll have 1 fear and 2 tokens, statistically. And he'll be able to use those for more than 2 hit points. So any ability that increases your damage becomes the highest priority in the game. For any character that wants to do damage, the damage that you do when you hit is the most important thing in combat. Statistically, it's the most important thing. Doing 2 hit points instead of 1 is so important in balancing out the combat math. If you can't deal 2 hit points of damage to a character, sometimes you're really going to struggle to make these combats feel good. So if you're a new player and you're playtesting this, and you and your friends have gotten together, threw together characters, and you're struggling with the combat, most likely it's because you're not doing enough damage. When you take your action, you have to do enough damage to make it count. Making the attack hit is obviously the second priority. As long as you're succeeding with hope, you don't ever pass the turn back to the GM. So if you take an action and fail, now you've given a token and potentially a fear and did nothing. Failures are statistically really bad in combat, so make sure you hit. Stats are a big deal. If you're a support character, your support spell needs to do more attrition than the enemy can gain from what you give them. So if you're a wizard and you take an action, you give a token, you roll fear, you give the GM the turn with a token and fear. Whatever you did on your turn needs to have been more useful than what the DM gets in return. For example, wizards, the Codex domain has a Book of Ava ability that you hit something in melee and you eject it out to far range. Characters can't reasonably close from long range, from far range to melee. At least from what I've read, the typical monster can move the equivalent of close. So they're going to take 2 turns to move back into combat. So even though you've given the GM a token, he has to use that token to move back toward your party and maybe not even attack. So in that sense, once you've done that as a wizard, the damage that you do is good, and then you've ejected the character out to far range. There's no saving throw, it just happens. So then that character has to get back into melee range later. burning up the tokens that you've given them. So again, when we're doing character building, we're going to pay a lot of attention to this. We're going to try to make sure that our combat moves, the things that we would do in combat, do at least as much as we're giving over to the game master. So to increase damage, proficiency skill is at all tiers. For the levels 2, 3, and 4, you get 1 proficiency. For the next 2 tiers, you can level up proficiency twice. You can end up with a total of 6 weapon proficiency. When you roll a damage in the game that says D10, D12, if it doesn't have a specific number of dice that you're rolling, it's subject to proficiency. So all the basic weapons that you would pick in the game, for example, have a D8, D10, D12, and at 6 proficiency, you would roll 6 D12, 6 D10. Any skills that increase proficiency, some skills in the game say attack at +1 proficiency, that gives you another die. Skills that just increase damage, like flight, for example. If you look at the Seraph, while they're flying, they do an additional D8. Very powerful early game ability because you take the damage that you do with the weapon, just add another D8 to it, and that's going to be the difference between you doing 1 hit point to the enemy and 2 hit points, which doubles the effectiveness of your turn. Skills that do damage on reactions. As far as I can tell, reactions do not generate action tokens for the GM. So, for example, in Bone, there's a retaliation skill. When you evade a melee attack, you can immediately damage them back. So it's damage for free. You do 2 hit points of damage, for example, back to the character on their turn because they missed you with an attack. And that's game-changing, right? First of all, they missed, so their action didn't do anything. Second of all, you attack them back. You don't give them a token. It's damage for free. It seems very powerful. Area effect skills that target multiple targets. Again, double your hit points. If you can only do 1 hit point with a spell, but you can target 3 different characters with it, now that's really powerful, right? You're doing 3 hit points of damage with 1 single skill. So those types of effects are really good. And there's quite a few things in the game that allow you to take a stress and affect the second target. So those kinds of things are going to be very strong. As a player, you can also try to help your party control the GM's turns. There are skills that generate hope. Try to, again, replace the D12 with the D20, things like that. Let you re-roll. If you are in combat at a critical moment and somebody fails with fear and somebody has, I think it's called reassurance, you simply let that character re-roll, and the likelihood is you'll get a success one way or another and change the outcome of that action. Those are pretty strong skills. There's quite a few things that either prevent the GM from getting fear or that help steal fear from the GM. Those things are really interesting. I don't know how powerful. It feels powerful, for example. With the Daemon ancestry, you can, when you generate fear, you can simply take a stress and then don't generate the fear. If the GM's already getting tons of fear, then that's not a very good mechanic, but if you can keep the GM low on fear, or especially at a critical moment in combat, prevent the GM from getting the fear that he needs to power a character's abilities, it seems like it could be very strong. Make sure your turn counts. If you have something that uses hope and stress, make sure it counts. Basically, don't tickle the enemies. If you're tickling the enemies for 1 hit point or causing stress without causing another severe effect, then you're giving the GM more power than you're generating. And then use help or team up to ensure that important rolls are successful. So with the battle math, coming to a close here, because each monster can go each time the GM takes a turn, combats with something like 5 enemies, you don't have to struggle and fight to get that first enemy down quite as much as you do in normal D&D. However, you do at that point have to focus on keeping your characters with low damage thresholds out of melee range. So engage in a combat with a whole bunch of combatants. One fighter goes forward and marks one of the enemies, one fighter goes forward, marks another one of the enemies, and then 3 of the enemies just run around and kill your casters. So you have to be very careful of that. And, maybe your casters can't be too weak to take a hit. And at the same time, you do need some area effective spells to affect multiple enemies. So the dynamics of combat really change based on how many enemies are in the combat. Anyway, strong ranged attacks are going to be very desirable. So for melee characters, the limited movement that you get in the game can easily be a problem. If you have a bunch of ranged enemies and you just have to cross the battlefield to get to them, you either have to make a bunch of agility rolls for long range movement, or you have to trudge across the battlefield taking a bunch of hits from these ranged characters. So for your own party, I would say 50% of your characters need to be ranged attackers if you want to be fully effective, and that way you can have one rank that closes to melee and gets close, does their thing, and one rank further back that tries to stay out of combat as much as possible, but can affect things at range and get to those archers in the distance. And again, I didn't read anything about attacks of opportunity, so a character can always use their turn to get more distance. The other thing that some other people have already pointed out is that passing is an issue. And let's say you've got a good warrior in your team, and he's doing a lot of damage, and he's built his character in a good way. And it's the first turn of the game. The the warrior runs out and does a bunch of damage. Everybody else in the party looks at each other and goes, "Pass," you know. He's doing his thing. He's out there carving stuff up. We don't want to give the GM a whole bunch of tokens. My attacks aren't as good as his attacks. He's a character built for combat. I want to role play, so yeah, you know what? I'm going to role play back here, sleeping on my backpack. See you later. And from what I understand, if you pass your turn, you don't have to put an action marker on the tracker. So in D&D, you're forced to take a turn. For better or for worse, you have to take a turn when it's your initiative. And you can pass that turn. That's fine. But there's no consequences either way if you take a turn or pass. In this game, if you pass a turn, you avoid the consequence of a roll, giving fear to the GM, giving him a token. So there's unfortunately high value in passing. And, in this case of the warrior, you let him take 3 turns in a row. He'll kill a couple things before the enemies have a chance to close, whatever it is. Limit the amount of tokens the GM gets. Strategically, again, mathematically, that could be exactly the right thing to do for your table. So we don't want, we don't really want players that are going to sit out of combat. But that's something we're going to have to figure out in play testing, right? Because if really you can build a character and it's a skill-based character, and then every time you go into combat, just do nothing, I don't think that's really how we want to play the game. So anyway, some things to think about there. Passing is too good. And in certain circumstances, I wouldn't mind if a spellcaster ran out of spells and had to pass because they had nothing else to do. That's, let's say flavorful, that's in character. And if that happens sometimes, then it's fine. But if characters are just planned to build characters that aren't good in combat and then just pass during combat, I think that's a hole in the system. So conclusion, every character in the game has domain cards that add value. Every domain has good stuff in it. There are, especially at the higher levels, the 9 and 10 levels, you would expect like similar power levels, but there really are some domains that have super powerful 9 and 10, and there's some domains that really lack any kind of sincere power at that level, which is strange. So I think that definitely needs to be evened out, hopefully before the official release. But anybody can grab in this game. Anybody can grab a D10 weapon or a dual staff that has D8 plus 10 damage right at the start of the game. Get the right trait and have a proficiency at level 2. So you start out with a +2 to your main stat. Pick a weapon that has that main stat at level 2. Level up your trait. Get that trait to +3. Level up your proficiency. Get a second damage die, and everybody is dealing decent damage against tier 0 and tier 1 combatants. Just about any character in the game can be effective. So mathematically, literally every single character in the game, no matter what you play, no matter what you're trying to do, your first tier, when you hit level 2, you level up your main stat, your secondary stat, and you take proficiency. Again, that's the math, okay? So let's talk about the conclusions altogether and see how that affects building characters, which I'm planning to do, right? In D&D 5e, almost anybody that's planning for a sustained damage character with a weapon is going to take either Great Weapon Master or Sharpshooter. Those feats let you drop 5 to hit and gain plus 10 to damage when you're making multiple attacks in a round. Maybe normally you'd be able to do 20 damage a hit. Now all of a sudden you're doing 30 damage a hit across 2 or 3 hits. And that makes a difference of 50% of your damage in one feat. Elven Accuracy is a standout feat for anybody who takes the Elven. I mean, a lot of people take Elves as their class just for Elven Accuracy. It's that good. Silvery Barbs is a spell that's so ridiculously overpowered that people hate it. It's banned at some tables. And the truth is, if you look at character building, a character that could use these feats or skills or spells and decides not to is expressing a choice to not build an optimal character. And I know maybe you hate min-maxers and you hate optimizers, but that doesn't change the fact that it's a mathematical truth that a character built with Great Weapon Master is better than a character that's built without it. If you're using Polearm Master and you don't pick Great Weapon Master, you're choosing to have a suboptimal character. Again, not judging, I'm just stating that mathematically that's true. And when one spell, feat, or ability is that powerful, it becomes the illusion of choice. And in the next revision of D&D that they're talking about for 2024, they have paid a lot of attention to this. They've talked about it a lot. They've worked on it a lot in the game. They want choice to be real. And when I look at character building in the playtest materials, they've succeeded. Any one of the level 1 feats for any given character, alertness, toughness, magic initiate, there are so many good feats that could be character defining feats at level 1. It's back to being a real choice. Not everybody's going to pick toughness or alertness, right? So I think proficiency in this game is the illusion of choice. I think every single character in the game, again, if you want to be the best character you can be, you have to maximize proficiency at every tier, and you have to end up at level 9 with 6 proficiency. You have to level your stats every time you get a new tier. So that's 3 of your 6 potential level up slots that are taken. If you want to do a subclass for your character, that's going to be it's going to be a 4th choice that's used up. And if you want your experiences to be relevant, burning a hope for a +2 is pretty steep. Burning a hope for a +1 is kind of a no-go. I don't see many people who are going to use these experiences and burn a hope just to get a +1 on a die roll. Again, statistically, a different character in the party could burn a hope and give you advantage, and it's a D6, which is going to roll a 3 or 4. So to make experiences on the same level as somebody else just helping you, you have to level them up at least twice. Your +2 skill has to go to +4, and one of your +1 skill has to go to +3 to be on the same level as the help action. And of course, you could still add the help action on top of that, but 1 hope is worth 3.5 stats with a help. Then 1 hope needs to be worth 3.5 when you're using your experiences. That just, again, statistically makes it equal. So if that's the case and you really want to use these experiences in combat or out of combat, you're looking at leveling them up at least once at each tier. So now you've got proficiency, traits, experiences, and subclass, and you've got 4 to 5 of your 6 choices pre-selected. So I think ultimately, even though you could just go in there and click anything for your character and choose all kinds of different stuff and build characters in different ways, I think anybody who doesn't follow this path is building a mathematically suboptimal character. So I'll be working on this, and I will be fighting to try to find ways to make more variability in it, but I think all my character builds are going to max out proficiency and main traits 100%. So you can build up anything, right? However, just like any other role-playing game, if you don't maximize your traits and proficiencies, then you're going to be choosing to play a suboptimal character. And again, depending on your GM, that may or may not be relevant. So this is just something we need to work through in playtesting, but I expect feedback's going to be, if you play a real campaign that's not just a one-shot, you're going to feel, I think, pretty roped in on what you take at each one of your level ups. So the conclusions for the GM. This is rules light for a player. I like it. I see the simplicity of it. Anybody can get in, just click some buttons and have a level 1 character and get started right away. The rules aren't that hard to understand. You're going to roll 2d12 for just about everything unless the game specifically tells you to do something else. So from a player side, for a new player first starting a role-playing game, man, easy, right? Start a character, get going. The problem is the GM then becomes make or break for the game. This is a game for starting players, but man, I would think this game is going to be rough for a first-time GM. Matt Mercer has an incredible imagination. He can pull a rabbit out of a hat. He can let characters try stupid stuff, and he's never even intimidated in the slightest. He creates a story out of it that's fair to the characters, or maybe not fair to the characters, but in a way that makes a good story. And I think as one of the influences for this game, we may have forgotten that not every GM can be as good as some of the GMs that have participated in Critical Role. Not everyone is a Brian Iyengar, for example. Again, there's people involved in this with just fantastic imagination, and they'll be able to run this game at a drop of a hat. But for a 14-year-old kid who's trying to play this with his buddies, being a GM is going to be something that needs a lot more guidance. So I think one of the things I'm also going to try to do is maybe do another little discussion on GM mechanics, things like that. But let's just go through a few things, right? Fear has to generate story in this game. If you don't generate attrition, the game is going to feel easy, non-threatening, low stakes. If everybody wants to come in the game and be Superman, then this is the game for you. The GM just allows everything. All your rolls are statistically highly likely to be successful, and you could just roll through the game stomping on everything, and maybe that makes you feel good. For characters who want a really good story, though, bad things have to happen, and in this game, the GM has to provide those consequences constantly. So when characters roll with fear, don't be afraid to provide negative consequences. Again, it shouldn't be a mean thing where you're out to get the characters, but it should also not be nice. It's got to be a balance of each. Make it clear as the GM that you're rooting for the characters. You want them to be heroic. You want them to win. Eventually, you want them to have good gear. You're not going to deny them resources in the game, or when they want advanced chainmail, give them a quest. Help them find it. But at the same time, you have to push these characters and raise the stakes. Again, if you just allow a bunch of rests with few combats in between, the system is not dangerous. So I would say provide out-of-combat attrition. Make sure that you're giving characters stress, armor loss, in extreme cases, maybe even hit point loss outside of combat to make the combats feel more dangerous. And also, I would say sometimes there has to be challenges that once failed have no solution, okay? Again, because the stats are so flat, we'll take a lock as an example. Rogue tries to pick a lock, rolls badly, fails. Fine, the fighter says, I'll try. The difference between the rogue trying it and the fighter trying it might only be 2. So the likelihood that this fighter is just going to walk up and pick the lock is 54%. Again, on a statistical average roll. And if they've invested in finesse at all as a secondary stat, they could easily have almost as good of a stat as the rogue. So rogue fails, okay, warrior tries, he fails, okay, fine, a sorcerer tries, fine, okay, the seraph tries. Everybody can try it, right? And each time they roll, maybe they generate a fear, maybe they generate a hope. You can fail with hope and still generate a hope even while failing. So I feel like there has to be some consequences in the game where if the rogue tries to pick a lock and fails, break the lock. Fail with fear, the lock is broke, nobody else can try to pick it, that's it, it's over, you can't get into that treasure chest ever. Okay, well the warrior's going to try to break it. Set a high DC, DC 22, go ahead, try. The warrior tries to break it, fails, that's it. Nobody else can try to break it. We're not going to play this game where every character gets to make a roll till luck comes out on our side. As a GM, I think in this system you really have to enforce that sometimes once a roll is tried, that's it, and whatever consequences, it's done and over. Even on a success with fear, for example, somebody's trying to sneak somewhere, or let's say in the case of this lock, somebody tries to open it and they succeed with fear, burn that fear immediately. Put it right back into the pool and say, okay, you succeeded with fear, but I'm going to burn that fear. And here's the story. There was a trap that you didn't detect. Well, I looked for traps and you told me there was no traps. Well, you didn't detect a trap. Now you know. Everybody in close range takes 8 damage. Well, you know, I have chainmail and a shield, so I can just, you know, tap this and not take any damage. Okay, take 1 stress. It's fine. You know, it's not a big deal. You do you. But this is the kind of thing that's going to cause attrition. And then by the time you get into combat, that armor slot is marked, that stress is marked, and it's going to make the combats harder. So this is my thought. The GMs need better guidance on exactly what can be done in and out of combat to generate this attrition. Adding monsters, I don't see in the rules that that's really a big thing. There are some adversaries who have specific things that say spend 2 fear and add a monster. I think it's fair. If you have medium-sized monsters, spend 2 fear, just add 1. It may not be in the rules, it may not be in the mission, but if your party can handle it, make it a little more dangerous without killing them, then put in another enemy. Now, if it's a tier 3 dragon or something like that, then you know, maybe it takes 5 fear to put that in. But use your judgment. Let the players see you using the fear. I feel like in some evaluations in the playtest, people have said, yeah, we had this pool, but I didn't really use the pool. I used something else. I used a counter, whatever. Use counters. Use something physical where you give it to the GM and you can see the GM using the fear. You see it come and go. I think that has psychological impact when people see the results of their actions being moved around that way. Okay, so in summary, with the math and statistics done, I'm going to do some playtest characters. Again, anybody can go in here and click choices and build a level 1 character, and the way this game plays out, literally almost any character you build at level 1 is going to be okay, right? Stats are so flat that at level 1, it almost doesn't matter what you pick. You'll feel like every other level 1 character. So to avoid the consequences of let's say, easy character generation, we're going to plan it all the way out to 10 with optimal choices to try to build a good level 10 character. That's going to inform all the things that we need to take at level 1. The builds that I do may not be optimal at first. We'll keep reading, playtesting, and at the end of it, if I do these builds and it generates some conversation in the community, that's great. That's feedback that we want to give to the creators of the game before it goes from open beta into official production. So that's my math. That's how I'm going to build characters. Hope to see you over my character guides. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to hit that like button on the way out if you didn't hit it on the way in. I sure would appreciate it. See you in the next one.